The choir is not walking out on my sermon. I hope. But we are experimenting with some PowerPoint slides today. It's a work in progress, and so they need to be down there to see them. And we're still working out the signals for when you change the slides. So if you see kind of the pastor to catcher kind of thing for baseball, where you kind of pull your ear or whatever, I'm just signaling to Curtis back there. It's probably an understatement to say that we live in an age of overlapping storms. Not only the physical storms, natural storms associated with climate change or not, but one storm comes almost before another is finished. And if you add other kinds of storms, they're overlapping. A pandemic that won't go away, wars and rumors of wars, and war almost on the streets of this country with gun violence, powerful residuals from racial inequalities, economic anxiety, harsh identity politics, the upcoming election. David Brooks on Friday night commenting on the general mood of the election says it's an apocalyptic mood that we're in, with people talking almost traumatically about if this person wins or this person wins. It's an absolute apocalyptic ending for democracy or for the country. And even this term, storm, I learned this week, the whole phrase coming storm, it's a code phrase for QAnon. I'm not a part of QAnon, and I'm not using it in that way, but it's a code word for QAnon and conspiracy theories about there's a coming storm, adopted, again, by some political persons. So we live in a trauma culture, some have said, with an apocalyptic language that talks about that culture. And even as it is with those in the psychological field, such as myself, we've got a fairly limited definition of what trauma is that produces PTSD. From the DSM, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And there's plenty of that in our culture. But also, as Bessel van der Kolk and others have argued for a long time, that's not the only definition of trauma that produces PTSD in people. So he said there are ACEs, A-C-E-S, adverse childhood experiences, such as divorce or poverty or racial inequality, that if you have enough of that, it creates a traumatic basis for your life. And building upon that, I would say you go beyond that to be able to say, I think we have adverse COVID experiences, long-term COVID, or reaction to vaccines, or even discussions about vaccines is almost traumatic in our culture. Adverse cultural experiences would be another of the ACEs in terms of incredible division between people. And we can't even talk to each other about certain things. Adverse church experiences. Many of those who are leaving church would say it's an adverse church experience that I've had, and I'm not going back. Or more natural settings in terms of the a long-term pastorate who leaves. We're about to face that. Or the recent sudden death of Dr. Calvin O. Butts III with the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City, in which there was not a plan for his replacement. That creates a trauma in a church and can be an adverse church experience. The Lazarus story really invites us into trauma that is often overlooked. Because when we think of the Lazarus story, we don't think of trauma. But think about it for a little bit. And look at the next slide, the picture in terms of the scripture itself and the picture that goes along with it. The Lazarus story, of course, being raised from the dead, is primarily recorded by John in the gospel as a sign of Jesus, one of the signs for the purpose of revealing who Jesus is. But it's also possible to view the Lazarus story as a trauma story from the perspective of Lazarus. Because the story had another purpose. Lazarus gets lost. The only other thing we hear about him in John's gospel is in chapter 12, where he is attracting attention of the chief priest to plot to kill him. More trauma for Lazarus. As we often assume with trauma victims who survive great trauma, we think that they ought to be overjoyed to be alive. When in fact, many of them, veterans, or if you lose a family and you're the only family member left standing, they would rather have died than be alive. We assume that they're grateful for what has happened, as opposed to talking about the trauma that they've experienced. And as we see in the case of Lazarus, we can be so focused on Jesus that we don't focus on Lazarus. And I think we often do that in our culture with trauma victims. This can be true not only for those who have survived death, but those who have survived racial trauma, assimilation trauma, immigration trauma, political trauma. We're often saying, aren't you grateful? Aren't things better now for you? Aren't you blessed to be in this country? When in fact, we haven't heard their trauma story. And the trauma is festering in the lives of people because we have not unwrapped the trauma that they've experienced in a way that can give them healing. We just assume they think it's all going to be better, and that's what we think about Lazarus. How we unwrap Lazarus is key to how we unwrap the trauma in our culture and the trauma in our lives, because we live in an age of trauma. Interestingly enough, two traditions emerged about Lazarus, one in the Eastern tradition, one in the Western tradition, that followed the story of Lazarus. It's not in Scripture, but it's in the traditions of the church. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, I'll call the PTSD tradition. And we might call it that tradition with characteristic, recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic event. That's the PTSD tradition. It's the Eastern tradition. The Western tradition, we might call this the PTG, the post-traumatic growth tradition, where through enduring and loss from and learning from loss, there can come positive discovery and radical reconstruction of life, also called stress-related growth, adversarial growth, or I would call it post-traumatic glory from a theological point of view. So the Eastern tradition is this. And this is the Church of St. Lazarus at Larnaca. According to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, sometime after the resurrection of the Christ, Lazarus was forced to flee Judea because of rumored plots on his life, and he came to Cyprus. And there he was appointed by Barnabas and Paul as the first bishop of Kition, present-day Larnaca. He lived there for 30 more years and then died and was buried for the second and the last time. According to this tradition, for 30 years, Lazarus never smiled. He was always with a scowl on his face, except for one time when he saw somebody stealing a pot, and he smilingly said, "The clay steals the clay." And sarcastically, he laughed. That was the only time he smiled in 30 years. That's the post-traumatic stress disorder side of the story. But the Western tradition is different. In the West, according to an alternative medieval tradition, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were put out to sea in the Mediterranean Sea in a vessel without oars, without sails, or without helm. And miraculously, their voyage led them to what is now a place today called Sainte-Marie in France. And the family was separated at that point. They went about preaching in southeastern Gaul. Lazarus goes to Marseille. He converts many people to Christianity there, and he becomes the first bishop of Marseille. He's later punished or killed under the reign of Domitian, and his body is transferred to Autun, where he is buried in Autun Cathedral that you see a picture of. The golden legend compiled in the 13th century records the provincial tradition. It also imagines a grand lifestyle for Lazarus and for his sisters. That's the PTG, the post-traumatic glory, the post-traumatic growth tradition that the Western tradition says about what happened to Lazarus after his trauma. And it's interesting for us to think about, well, what happens with this? The Western tradition, however, gets picked up, it gets lost. And for someone like, here's Charles the Bold accepting a book from George Castilian, the 15th century poet, who draws on the tradition of the unsmiling Lazarus. He whom God raised, doing him such grace, the thief, Mary's brother, thereafter had naught but misery and painful thoughts, fearing what he should have to pass. The West kind of overlooks the Western tradition and carries on more the unsmiling, the post-traumatic stress disorder tradition. Or Richard Zimler, 2019, a novel, The Gospel According to Lazarus. In his book, he says that Lazarus, in the end, has this traumatic saying almost. He says, I cannot even say what the afterlife looks like, for I did not see any. I did not return to my body with any prophetic message ciphered in my mind or engraved on my hands. Either my soul was denied admission to paradise, or nothing of what transpired there adhered to my memory, or worse, after we die, nothing of who we are survives. Carrying on almost the Eastern tradition in the West about the trauma that stayed with Lazarus, the PTSD. And in this story, Lazarus is never free from the ruminations about what had happened to him and what he had seen in the depths of the tomb. And that, in many ways, is exactly the task for the work of unwrapping Lazarus and unwrapping the trauma that we experience. How do you hold together the actual reality of the trauma, not deny it, and somehow enfold that into a meaning-making narrative that produces new life, post-traumatic growth, and not stuck on the ruminations about what was seen and could not be processed and could not be let go of, the unsmiling kind of Lazarus. And whether we do this nationally, globally, individually, communally, how is the trauma experience held on to and unfolded into a new life of meaning? We're facing that right now in our culture, in my opinion. So there are psychological predictors about whether you go one way or the other, PTSD or PTG. The Lazarus story can go one way or the other. Our story can go one way or the other. Since trauma overloads the body and the brain, the experience has been described by many as becoming frozen in time. Part of your mind freezes, your stories freeze, your brain freezes because you don't know what to do with the trauma. Nothing fits into our reality, so the stories become frozen. How does one become unfrozen, if I can use that word, unbound, or unwrapped, having had a traumatic experience? Or how in our culture today will we unwrap, unfreeze the stories in our cultures that are ruminating over and over and over again, creating cultural trauma? How do we do that? How do you move the stories forward? So how you deal with the ruminations is actually very important. Trauma creates repetitive thoughts. It's like a story that gets stuck. You can't find an ending to it because it absolutely overwhelms the brain. So the story gets stuck, and it takes a lot of care to unwrap Lazarus, to not just unwrap the physical body, but unwrap the experience, process it. Let Lazarus go free, not frozen, but freed. It takes great care to unwrap the mind of Lazarus. And if you do it too soon, timing is important. If you do it in a way in which you try to contain the story, you put it in a box, you freeze the story, what happens then? And the intrusive thoughts will leak out when you least expect it. You've got to process the story at the right time and in the right way. And you can also deny it by being too positive too soon. Praise the Lord, everything is okay. That's another way of avoiding the work of dealing with the trauma. Or you can create a story too soon. Like the child who is abused as a child, they will very early on, just as a means of survival, create a story that says, I'm a bad child, that's why this happened. You create a shame-based identity. Cultures do the same thing. We're in the midst of a culture that's doing the same thing, where people latch onto a story, whether it's real or not, in order to deal with the trauma. And it is a way of dealing with the trauma. But a coherent narrative of some kind, but unfortunately, that tends to replicate the trauma. And it gets the ruminations. Look at the social media echo chambers that we have and the news loops over and over and over again. Whether the story is true or not, people latch onto it as a means of avoiding the work of the trauma. And you can tell when they're avoiding the work. You have to do meaning making with the stories. And you have to do meaning making and weave new stories entirely out of the traumatic experience in a way that's both situational. You may have to rethink family, you may have to rethink community, you may have to rethink church, or you may have to rethink things globally, how the world works, how God works, how are we going to get through this? What does it mean that a clergy person abused me? What does it mean that a drunk driver killed my mother and he didn't even have a license? What does it mean that my country is not immune from terrorist attacks? What does it mean that my country has this freedom for all in its declaration but hasn't lived up to that? My first funeral that I ever did green out of seminary was the death of a 2-day-old infant. I can still see the father carrying the coffin under his arm. It's still clearly in my mind today. And this is not just grief and loss, because this couple had been infertile and for 12 years had prayed for a child, had an answer to prayer, and then the child dies 2 days later. Now, I had to put my world back together. And it set me on a trajectory of trying to understand how you help people at that level of trauma in their lives. If it's that traumatic for me, what about the parents who had to put their entire world back together in terms of who God is and how God works? Trauma does that, and you have to somehow face the trauma itself and over time unfold into a completely new story. And how you do that, and if you do that, predicts PTSD or PTG, the Eastern tradition of Lazarus or the Western tradition of Lazarus. But unwrapping and unbinding Lazarus also, it takes community. If the psychological predictor of what kind of community you're in, whether it's going to be healthy for you or not healthy for you, is very profound. Unwrapping Lazarus, even as the scripture says, produces a stench. It's a stench of unpleasant, awkward, uncomfortable, beyond words kind of experience that we in the Christian community, or even in a family or a community of care, has to somehow get their minds around it and be comfortable with staying in the stench with people, even if you don't have any answers. And to do that, we got to deal with our own stench and the way we process things and the way we think about God. The way that the community responds will determine whether or not the trauma stays and Lazarus stays wrapped up, or whether there is a community where that unwrapping with its stench can occur, and we can stay with people in that. I think the church has a tremendous role to play, not only one-on-one, but in the culture right now. The church has a role to play in terms of helping this culture unwrap the stench of this culture, rather than contributing to the stench of the culture, which I think we do sometimes. Pre-trauma is also as important as post-trauma. There is a saying here, I show this slide about the Duke of Wellington, who, since I'm an old white guy, this is an older white guy. I'm not the only old white guy in the room right now. I use this quote from the Duke of Wellington with caution because Eton was the school established, elite college established in 1414 that trained to this day, trains leading political figures in Britain. But of course, it also trained them to colonize the rest of the world and be empire that subjugated other people. So I use it with caution. I use it like that Samuel Wells does in his book on Christian ethics, where he says, Eton represents the long period of preparation. Waterloo, the final battle that defeated Napoleon, is just the moment of implementation, the moment of decision on the battlefield. You don't win Waterloo without the years of training at Eton. And the same thing holds true in our lives. Don't wait for a traumatic situation to occur. What happens pre-trauma will predict what happens after trauma. So for instance, in a family system that has learned to channel the story of we are victims or play the victims, what happens post-trauma is that just gets being victims, it just gets put on steroids. And again, I wonder about that happening in our culture right now, where so many people seem to be using a basic story, exaggerated, about playing victims. So there are psychological factors that determine whether it's PTSD or PTG, but there are also theological factors. Whether Lazarus gets bound or unbound, there are theological factors. We talk about the church being a trauma-informed church. Trauma has always been at the center of Christianity, if you think about it. It's always been trauma-informed and carries within it the potential to replicate trauma or transform trauma. And historically, it's done both, if we're honest with it. Theologically speaking, we are trauma-informed. Interestingly, the early Ignatius, who lived AD 30 to 107 and was a disciple of John, as mentioned by Polycarp, in his letter to the Ephesians, wrote of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper we're going to take, as the pharmakon athanasius, the medicine of immortality or non-death, the medicine of immortality. But pharmakon, we get our word pharmacy from that. Many of the medicines we take are somewhat poisonous, really. They introduce a poison into the body so the body can learn to react against it. Or chemotherapy almost seems like a poison, but it produces healing. In our own day, we have the same pharmakon. So Christianity can go one way or the other. It can be the medicine of immortality, or it can be a poison. We're called to digest the elements of death, really, blood, body broken, in order to produce life, the medicine of immortality. But if you don't do that right, what happens is the church replicates trauma. Two examples of this, Rene Girard, who converted late to Christianity, and he converted to Christianity because he saw in the cross and the death and resurrection of Jesus the potential to stop all violence in the world. Because God was on the side not of the victor, but of the victim on the cross. And then he saw Christianity as entering into the ones who had been harmed and transforming the suffering in a way that showed off the weaknesses of those who are in power. He converted to Christianity because of that. On the other hand, you get a poison. An illustration I've used before of Deidre Sujiki, who in the book Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving Church, says, Mom and Dad almost got a divorce, and instead of working on their problems, Dad got religion. And it was a religion that brought a forced way of being the family. Daughter who was abused in Christian schools, sent to the Dominican Republic for a boot camp in order to knock her bad habits out. Rather than working on the marriage, they projected all the problems on the kids. And the religion became a poison in that family system. So healthy theology, PTSD or PTG, it depends on whether or not it's a religion of containment or a religion of transformation. Jesus saw this in his woes to the Pharisees. Woe to you, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead men's bones. If you don't do that transforming work, you've got toxicity that's going to leak. And religion that contains and doesn't do the processing simply wraps things up in a tomb, a religious reliquary, spiritual bypass. It will leak all over the place. And I think we're seeing some of that in the culture as well. So trauma leaves us standing really on a threshold, determining which kind of stories we're going to create on that threshold. It's a threshold of possibility, but we can go either way. If you think linearly, you can think, are we going to go back to death, or are we going to go forward to new life? But it's always entangled with the question of what's the story going to be post-trauma? What's the story going to be? And this is the more ontological level where we can see, following the very word of apocalypsis itself, apocalyptic, we get the book of Revelation as the apocalypse. Do we have stories that are focused on an apocalyptic ending? Every time there's social disruption, we saw it in the 19th century, we saw it after the 1960s, we're seeing it now. You get a plethora of trauma-based stories that talk about the end of the world, apocalyptic eschatology. And you know that it's not healthy because you'll get more thrashing than threshing. On the threshold, we're supposed to do threshing, but we have to take ownership of what's going on, and we have to process the trauma. Thrashing, no, it simply blames other people, finds a scapegoat of some kind, full of anger, full of hatred, but they usually get connected to some kind of Christian apocalyptic story about the end of the world. And we've got all of those going on in our culture right now. It takes great wisdom to not get caught up and respond in kind to traumatic stories that people are developing that are end-time stories. But we need to offer something else, and that's apocalypse as opening. On the threshold of possibility, there can come stories of opening where we are waiting, we are still, we're in the midst of the trauma, moment after moment after moment until God reveals to us and gives an opening for a new story. Can we work with people? Can we work with the nation? Can we be those people who don't get caught up in the trauma and the reaction and the loops of this conspiracy theory and that, or this is the end of the world, or this is the end of the culture, but say, these are trauma stories. And how are we going to wait and hold the trauma until, in fact, in the presence of God, we get stories that might be unpredictable, but totally new? The church was developed out of a PTG, post-traumatic growth tradition, in which the leader of the movement was crucified, created trauma in the disciples, who ruminated in a positive way to create a story that gave new life to people. Can we do that today? And as we approach this Lord's Supper table, is it going to be for us the medicine of immortality? Or is it going to simply be a poison by which we contain things until it leaks out in toxic ways in the culture? I would say, let us move to this table looking for the opening from the medicine of immortality.